very warm welcome to everyone to this BIOLEGIS live webinar. We're very happy that so many people have registered. We have about 160 registrants, so that is fantastic and shows what an important topic it is for the pharmaceutical industry throughout Europe. And the topic of today's webinar is the overview of the laws on drug advertising and SmPC compliance in Europe. To give you a quick overview of the contents of this webinar, we will first tell you a little bit about BIOLEGIS in case you're not familiar with the organization. We will then introduce our project, the comparative overview of drug advertising in 17 European countries. We will then talk a little bit more about the details of drug advertising laws and SmPC compliance in Germany, France, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And at the end, we will have a Q&A session where you can ask your questions to the speakers, and we'll try to answer everything as precisely as possible so that you can take as much information from this webinar as possible. So first, a few words about BIOLEGIS. BIOLEGIS is a pan-European network of law firms specializing in healthcare and life sciences law. So there are currently 21 member firms covering more than 20 European countries. The network was founded in 2004. It's an independent and non-exclusive network. And all the member firms that are part of this network have a deep expertise in life sciences, healthcare, and pharmaceutical law. And this allows the member firms to provide local specialist advice on these fields of law in cross-border collaborations and cross-border matters. And one of the projects of BIOLEGIS has been the interpretation of compliance with the SmPC by local authorities and local industry associations project, a comparative analysis of the legal situation in 17 European countries. A publication has been prepared with an overview page on the beginning and details on all the 17 member states, and all the participants to this webinar. They will afterwards get a download link where you can download the presentation to this of this webinar. You can also download the publication for your personal use in everyday work, and you can also then download the video of this webinar in case you want to share it with colleagues and contacts. So today's speakers, let me introduce first my colleagues Domitil Philippe from Allais Avocats in France, who will speak about the French situation, Joanna Krakowiak from Wadiński & Partners in Poland, who will introduce you to the laws in Poland, and Katarina Slavikova of Havel & Partners in the Czech Republic, who will let you know more about the laws in the Czech Republic. And I will give you an introduction on the laws in Germany. I'm from the focus group Digital Health of the German law firm SKW Schwarz. So a quick introduction to the comparative overview project and the legal framework that it is based on. So as you all know, the basis for pharmaceutical advertisement in Europe is Directive 2001/83/AC, and there in particular Article 87, subsection 2. And it basically says that advertising for pharmaceuticals must comply with the particulars listed in the summary of product characteristics, the SmPC, and that the SmPC is the central reference point across all EU member states. And then we have a landmark ruling by the European Court of Justice, the Novo Nordisk decision of 2011. And in this decision, the court said that additional claims beyond the SmPC are in general permissible if they confirm or refine the SmPC. The claims must be compatible with and must not misrepresent the SmPC. They must be objective, non-misleading, accurate, up-to-date, and sufficiently complete. And the sources of scientific publications must be faithfully cited. These principles basically apply throughout the European Union, but the question arose in our network, is it actually applied identically throughout the member states, or are there differences? How far can advertising go beyond the SmPC based on these standards using non-registration studies in the various member states? Is it all the same? Because we have a unified directive and because we have the Novo Nordisk ruling, or is it different in the member states? And the analysis brought up a very interesting result, in particular that the application and the interpretation diverges significantly across the member states, also with regard to enforcement and self-regulation. And this is why we have drawn up this overview and we have set up this webinar to give you an idea of how different the approach can be in the member states concerning drug advertisement and its SmPC compliance, even with regard to this unified basis that we have. And some key findings that we found out in this analysis is that with regard to non-registration studies, there's a wide range of different interpretation. For example, Germany has a relatively liberal standards where gold standard studies are widely accepted as a basis for application as long as it doesn't lead to the advertisement of off-label use of pharmaceuticals. And whereas, for example, in Sweden and the Czech Republic, only strict compliance and strict adherence to the SmPC content is legal. So there's a wide range of different interpretations in the member states. And this also applies to industry self-regulation. So there are some active codes in some member states and which are generally adhered to, whereas in other member states, either codes don't exist or they are not legally binding in any way. Regulatory enforcement is also different. So we have, for example, in Germany, a rather competitor-driven enforcement, while in other member states, it's rather authority-driven. And the question always is, are English texts available where I can get a better idea of the rules and requirements in other states? Because, for example, when I look into countries like Poland or Czech Republic, I don't speak the language, but if English versions are available, then I can get a better first idea what the legal provisions are. And we have found out that in many countries, English guidelines are available, while in others, like for example in France, Sweden, Netherlands, Turkey, and Spain, they are not. So after this introduction, we will give you a first overview of the 4 countries to give you a better idea on the findings that we had in this comparative overview at the example of 4 countries, and also to educate you a little bit about the drug advertising laws and SmPC compliance laws in these countries. And I will start with Germany, and after that we will talk about France, Poland, and the Czech Republic. So generally in Germany, as already mentioned, we have a relatively wide interpretation of confirming or refining the SmPC in drug advertisement according to the Novo Nordisk standards. As a general rule, you can say that scientifically valid study results, in particular from so-called gold standard studies, gold standard, means randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled, peer-reviewed, and with adequate statistic evaluations. So the results from these studies, they may in general be used in advertising, even if the study results are not contained in the SmPC or not contained yet. And in any case, but that's also comes from the standards, from the European standards, the studies must always be cited correctly. The question arises, can I use a study that is below this gold standard study, like a retrospective study or a lab study? And in general, yes. So if the study, according to its scientific requirements, has been carried out correctly and in accordance with the scientific standards, then it can be possible, depending on the circumstances, to use the study results in advertisement if the limitations resulting from that kind of study are revealed and laid open in the advertisement, and also the other limitations are clearly mentioned. So you can do that in a footnote, for example. But there's some additional limitations coming from the German Healthcare Advertising Act, the Heilmittelwerbegesetz. The most important one is that under Section 3A of the Healthcare Advertising Act, it is not allowed to advertise the off-label use of pharmaceutical products. So it's so if the study result actually concerns a different indication than the one for which the pharmaceutical product is authorized, then it's not allowed to use that in general. So then you first have to adapt the marketing authorization accordingly. Also, another rule that we have in Germany is that the advertisement of prescription drugs must be strictly limited to healthcare professionals. So it's not allowed to advertise prescription drugs outside this circle of healthcare professionals. And this is particularly important when we speak about social media, because in social media content, sometimes you see that people from or representatives of pharmaceutical companies, when they post photos from conferences or industry exhibitions at conferences, and in the back you can see advertisement for prescription drugs. That would, strictly speaking, be a violation of this law, because it then shows advertising for prescription drugs in the background, and it's freely accessible and not only limited to healthcare professionals. And in Germany, we have the principle of strictness, which means that there are particularly strict requirements as to the correctness, clarity, and unambiguity of health-related claims. So even a low risk of recipients being misled renders the advertising unlawful. So I've already mentioned that enforcement in Germany is perhaps a little bit different than in other countries because it's competitor focused. Under the German Unfair Competition Act, competitors have claims to stop infringing advertisement of their rival companies. So if pharma company A sees an advertisement of pharma company B, which is considers to be unlawful under the applicable standards, it can send a cease and desist letter and also can take that company to court in civil action, which often happens in injunctions. And that's a very efficient and fast way to stop illegal advertisement by companies in Germany. We also see increased activities over the last years by consumer protection and competition organizations, in particular if certain advertisement, for example, for non-prescription drugs, concerns consumers, and the advertisement is or could be misleading, then they send cease and desist letters to pharmaceutical companies. But they pursue these matters often in main proceedings, not in injunctions, so that you usually have more time to react to that and to adapt. Authority action, on the other hand, is a little bit less likely in Germany because it's so much competitor driven, and competitors are usually quite active when it comes to advertising violating the laws in Germany. It's rather rare that authorities actually address advertising by pharmaceutical companies. So that is mainly done by the competitors. If enforcement takes place, the focus is always on cessation and assistance, so about stopping the advertisement violating the law, and to a limited extent to reimbursement of legal costs. Damages don't play a role for some relatively simple reason. First of all, in order to claim damages for advertisement that violates unfair competition law, you would have to first demonstrate that you have lost sales due to that advertisement, which is basically not possible. And second is, in order to claim lost profits, you would have to lay open your calculation of profits to your competitor, and that's normally not desirable. A warning, which is often overlooked and is very important from our experience, the response deadlines to cease and desist letters and in Germany are usually very, very short. 1 week is considered completely okay under German law. So if you get a cease and desist letter with a 1 week reply deadline, it's highly advisable to get legal advice immediately and to adhere to that deadline, because the sender of the cease and desist letter can immediately go to court if the sender hasn't received an answer within that 1 week deadline. To give you an example how this is treated in practice, I've brought you a case here. It's a real case from the Federal Court of Justice. It's the Synopret case. Synopret is a medicinal product that is indicated for acute uncomplicated inflammation of the paranasal sinuses. And the advertisement that was subject to this court case was a claim that the drug had an anti-inflammatory and antiviral effect. The anti-inflammatory effect in the SmPC was addressed, but it was only demonstrated in animal studies and in vitro studies, but not in human studies showing clinical relevance. And the court decided that the advertisement was held to be misleading, because the addressed public expects the claimed anti-inflammatory and antiviral effect to be proven as a result of a scientifically valid human study with clinical relevance. So that shows the study approach of the German case law and the principle of strictness. And what is very important to understand in relation to the SmPC and advertisement here, had the claimed therapeutic effect within the approved indication been proven by a gold standard study in humans, then advertising with an anti-inflammatory and antiviral effect would have been legal under the principle of strictness, although not expressly contained in the SmPC. So the case was not lost because it was not in the SmPC. The case was lost because there was no proper human study that showed the advertised anti-inflammatory and antiviral effect. And with that, I would like to pass on to Domitil to tell us something about the legal situation in France.
Thank you, Oliver. France is governed by EU for sure and national regulatory controls. The third thing is that the advertising must faithfully reflect the marketing authorization and the SMP. The rules are codified in the French Health Public Code, which provide that the advertising must not be misleading. It must present the drug objectively. It must promote its proper use, and it must comply with the SmPC and the therapeutic strategy recommended by the French National Authority for Health, which is the HAS. In practice, it means that promotional claims must be traceable to the relevant section of the SmPs. Otherwise, the advertising materials must be considered misleading. Furthermore, a distinctive feature of the French system is that there is a regulatory pre-control of the French National Agency for Medicines and Health Products, which is called the ANSM, and which will issue a visa for the advertising, whatever the form of the advertising and whatever the public for the advertising, whether it's the general public or advertising targeting professionals for prescription medications. So in any case, you must first get a prior approval from the French regulator prior to making any ads. And you have to make a filing for either general public advertising or professional advertising. It's two separate filings, which is done online. And upon being granted this visa, it's valid for 2 years, unless there is any changes to the marketing authorization. And with respect to scientific publication, this is allowed in promotional materials, but it is subject to strict interpretation of objectivity. First of all, with respect to the ANS, to the French regulator of visa, you must list the studies that are being used, whether they have been registered or non-registered. You have to provide a full bibliographic listing of all the studies and highlight the portion of the studies that would be used, so that the French regulator can check whether it is in line with the study, whether the conclusions are correct, and whether it would be misleading or not. The main regulatory risk is that there is a selective presentation of data. You don't give the full picture of the results, or there are claims that are not reflected in the SmPC. Even though it would be scientifically plausible and evidence, if it's not part of the SmPC, the claim will not be valid. And as the studies are mostly used in advertising targeting professionals, it must be included safety information alongside the efficacy data that are being used in the promoting materials. The thing is that healthcare professionals must be able to assess the benefit and risk balance of the drug. So that's why the promotional materials must be complete, accurate, and verifiable. I think, Oliver, you can move on to the next slide. As per the enforcement action, the thing is that we have very few case law in France due to the pre-control from the French regulator. It's an administrative control, meaning that there can also be civil action, but will not be focused on the content of the advertising that has been validated by the French regulator. But even though the French regulator grants this marketing, the advertising visa, it does not mean that there is no legal risk, because the French regulator can always suspend or withdraw the advertising authorization, and it can also prohibit advertising that is non-compliant. We had a case that was the Alchemist decision, which was made public. It was at the time where the French regulator control was not prior to the advertising, but afterwards. But there is the same situation. If you do not get a visa and you launch an advertising campaign, there will be a public decision prohibiting the use of the ad, and which may be also subject to administrative fines. Besides the regulatory enforcement action, competitors may still bring civil claims, because any advertising for drugs must comply with, must not be an unfair commercial practice. So you could still challenge the way the advertising campaign was laid, the content of the information that are not strictly related to public health situation. But as I said, there is few case law on that subject, and the only recent case was the Dovato case for an HIV product, and all the claims were dismissed, both at the first level and before the Paris Court of Appeal, because the judge mostly relied for the public health content on the visa granted by the French regulator. It couldn't make another assessment. It could not challenge the assessment made by the French regulator. So as there was an advertising visa that was granted for this product, it was considered that the promotional content were valid, but then it just focused on content and wording and whether the advertising was comparative to a competitor product, and consider that it was not misleading or denigrating, and so the claims were dismissed. This is all for a short summary of the French situation, and I hand over to Joanna for more information with respect to Poland.
Thank you. So let me share a couple of thoughts about this type of rules that I apply in Poland. Well, basically in Poland, as well as in other countries, we do have national rules that govern medicinal advertising. It's included in the Polish Pharmaceutical Act, in the regulation of the Minister of Health, as well as in the Act on combating unfair competition. Because as Oliver already said, we also do have disputes between competitors, not only administrative cases, but civil cases as well. And what is really important, we do have industry guidelines that are very influential. The main ones in Poland are INPHARMA. INPHARMA is part of FPA and National Medicines Manufacturers. This association is part of Medicines for Europe. What are the key features that are very characteristic for Poland? First of all, we do have a restrictive approach. And also the Chief Pharmaceutical Inspector, which is the supervisory body for the pharma market, has very extensive powers to control advertising and the whole pharmaceutical market. In fact, they do have a nickname, and this is the nickname is Pharmaceutical Police. So everyone is really afraid. If they start inspections, they can be quite tough. So what they check? Well, basically they check compliance with summary product characteristic. And this is a very restrictive approach. So basically it has to comply. The words do not have to be identical, but they have to have the same meaning so that they are not misleading or ambiguous. And if some companies try to use some supplementary phrasing, confirms or that confirm or clarify summary product characteristics, this information is acceptable as long as it does not distort or over-interpret the summary product characteristics. So these are the main rules, and let me share you a couple of cases. The first case was about comparative advertising. There were two products. The first one, permethrin, was compared with Infectoscap cream. And basically these are more or less the same products, generic products from many times, a long time on the. There was a type of chart distributed mostly within pharmaceutical warehouses, but also sometimes doctors and pharmacists that compared these features. And basically in Poland, you can have comparative advertising of medicinal products, but of course, there are very strict rules. And even though this comparison was more or less in compliance with the summary product characteristic, it was ambiguous. So let's take it step by step. Clinical trials. Well, basically, there was no clinical trials with respect to permethrin. That's true. There were also no trials with respect to Infectoscap. So that was inaccurate, in fact. When it comes to treatment periods, the treatment period was exactly the same for both products. So it was between 8 hours and 14 hours. But what was indicated here is to show that the Infectoscap works faster. So you only need 8 hours, whereas permethrin is up to 14 hours. And the last but not least, it was about the application. And on the application, the court said that you cannot refer to properties of a medicinal product resulting simply from its form unless it's specifically addressed in the summary product characteristic. So because the comparison here showed that it's a gel, okay, so alcohol evapors quickly and the gel dries. So this is always true because of the pharmaceutical form. And recipients, addressees of this advertising could have had false understanding that the infectoscop is better because the cream remains on the skin for a long time. This is what they claimed. So, this comparison does not fulfill the requirements. And let me add one more thing. That was a ruling of a civil court in Warsaw. And basically, this is an exception because most cases are of an administrative nature. And this one wasn't. So basically, one of the companies applied for a preliminary injunction. In fact, they didn't obtain the preliminary injunction, but the reason was that they were tolerating this infringement for too long time. In Poland, we have a rule that you have to act quickly. Quickly means within 6 months from the time when you get the information on the infringement. So they acted too slow, but on the otherwise, they probably would have obtained this PI because the court clearly said that this is a misleading comparison. Okay. So another case. That was a product invented by one of the Polish OTC manufacturers. And as you can see, the structure was quite complicated. There was a platform, and on the platform, there was a program for pharmacists. So the program was open to participate to all pharmacists in Poland and people with pharmaceutical profession, pharmacists. So if a pharmacy joined this program, they were obligated to provide information on the specific medicinal products of that manufacturer, both recommendation as well as some educational content. And there were scoring points for this. When they gathered certain threshold of points, they were entitled to gifts. The gifts were not very high value, but definitely over the allowed value of 100 Polish zlotys, that is like 20 euros. This is the allowed gift value in Poland. So basically, they could have won laptops, for example, or some other items. So that was a challenge for the authorities. And let's see how the case was decided. There was a defense. Basically, the defense of the platform, the manufacturer, was that it's education. So patients benefit because pharmacists provide education. And in fact, in Poland, the Polish Act on the Pharmacist Profession imposes a duty to provide pharmaceutical care. So the pharmacists have an obligation, statutory obligation, to educate patients and consumers. And this was the main argument in defense. But the weakness here was that they were obtaining benefits for this, whatever you call it, educational or advertising activities. Of course, if you have education and if you perform work, it's possible to justify that you are allowed to have a remuneration for work actually performed. But here, the context was clearly promotional, Because first of all, the pharmacists had to inform, recommend a certain product. Once recommended, they were providing information, and this information, this educational part, was quotation from a patient leaflet about counterindications. And that's it. And they received this, they were gaining points irrespectively if there was a purchase done or not. But on the other hand, they were also transferring very valuable data to the platform, sales data, stock data, etc. So this case was decided by the pharmaceutical authorities and appealed to Court of Appeals, and finally the Supreme Administrative Court rejected the platform's defense and decided that the educational campaign was carried out after recommending a product covered by the program and before purchasing. So the product recommendation was first. And the other element, which was also important, that by accepting the terms and conditions of the program, pharmacists agreed to transfer highly detailed sales inventory data. So that was, in the end, it turned out to be prohibited, and it's not used in this form anymore. So let's move to the last case. This is, it shows you how innovative people are, and there's a clash between, you know, certain freedom of artistic performance and pharma rules. Because the character that you can see on the slide, his name is Taco Hemingway, and he's quite a popular rap singer. And in December 2025, he released a song titled "I Fell in Love Outside the Pharmacy." And in the lyrics, the name of the drug solpadeine appears several times. And in fact, the song was very popular, and the drug became very popular too. It was purchased by the fans, many times. So basically, the authorities are currently investigating this case. First of all, they asked the marketing authorization holder if they authorized Taco to do this advertising, and they rejected. So basically now there are proceedings pending against Taco Hemingway for unlawful advertising of a medicinal product, meaning unlawful that without authorization from the marketing authorization holder. So we'll see how the situation will develop, and if it happens that the authorities will impose a fine on Taco Hemingway, it will be a clear sign that the definition of what is pharma advertising in Poland is extremely broad.
So hard to continue after a rap song. Now let me turn to the Czech Republic, which is actually one of the strictest and most formalistic countries. You will see it on the overview that you will receive after this webinar. We are there in the red zone. So I must start with mentioning our competent authority, the State Institute for Drug Control, known by its Czech acronym SUKL. And also we have Innovative Pharmaceutical Industry Association, part of FPI as well, that has its own code of practice applicable to advertising activities of its member companies, obviously. Well, when it comes to legal framework, it's basically the same like in other European countries, other countries that you will see on the overview. We have actually transposed the directive. So our advertising must again be compatible with the SmPC. It does not mean that it has to be word for word identical, but there are additional claims permitted if they are again compatible with the SmPC, not misleading. They must be objective, verifiable, and properly sourced. So far, I believe this sounds familiar, and it seems that the Czech Republic has interpreted Novo Nordisk framework precisely. However, what differs is the decision-making practice and the real enforcement. I will have it on the next slide, but there is like a big gap between the Novo Nordisk ruling and the way how it is actually applied. What is useful and worth mentioning for companies operating cross-border is the pre-clearance mechanism that is offered and actually foreseen by the regulation. So Czech SÚKL offers paid consultations on planned activities. It's a fee-based service, and it might bring necessary legal clarity on any contemplated campaigns. And when it comes to enforcement model, as opposed to what Oliver was mentioning for Germany, we are very much authority-driven, meaning that SÚKL would be initiating inspections proactively, either based on their own inspection plan or based on submissions from whomever, HCPs, lay population, or competitors, rather than waiting for judicial decisions to resolve the question of the advertising compliance with the SmPC. So it would be rather SÚKL's inspection. I must also mention that the industry association has competence to impose sanctions on its members for breaching the code. So companies need to be mindful on both tracks. Okay, we can move to the next slide, please. And now let me turn to what it looks like in practice, because this is where the Czech Republic becomes quite noteworthy from cross-border perspective. SÚKL actually applies very narrow interpretation of what it means to confirm or refine the SmPC. Specifically, long-term follow-up data, real-world evidence data, and meta-analysis that are not yet reflected in the SmPC are, according to our own consultations passed with SÚKL or with from our client cases, treated as new data, even if they concern the same clinical parameters as those parameters that are already included in the SmPC. And this applies regardless of data type. So as I mentioned, this approach applies to follow-up studies, to real-world evidence data, to network meta-analysis. None of these are treated automatically supplementary to the SmPC. Now, I would like to pause a bit on this point because this is an important point. We are not talking here about, in cases of follow-up studies, for instance, we are not talking about data on new indication, data on new patient population, or data on different endpoints. We are talking about data that look at the same parameters as those that are actually included in the SmPC for a longer time horizon. And yet, the position of the authority is that as long as the data are not specifically mentioned in the SmPC, they constitute new data, full stop. And then you might actually ask, what remains in the category of additional claims, right? So a few additional aspects and thoughts. If your results are numerically superior to the data that are in the SmPC, it is actually an aggravating factor. So I believe there are two ways of interpreting this situation. Either you may say that it actually confirms the data that are in the SmPC, but in SÚKL's interpretation practice, it's actually worsening the situation. And this all applies regardless of the scientific quality and used methodology of the studies. So as Oliver was presenting the requirements on studies in Germany, we are not in this level of discussion yet, unfortunately. When it comes to the audience, again, HCP audience is not a mitigating factor. So again, we could have a discussion whether HCPs who are prescribers, experts should be able and definitely are able to make their own critical judgment, and they are able to evaluate whether follow-up data, real-world evidence data, meta-analysis are relevant for their decision-making practice. However, in our environment, HCPs are basically sort of protected against any additional data that are not specifically mentioned in the SmPC. Now, to conclude with something positive, I must mention that our industry association has offered less strict and, in our view, still legally sound interpretation of the situation. There was a dialogue with the regulatory authority. And I also must mention that the Ministry of Health in some appeal cases has taken less strict stance. However, as things stand today, companies operating on the Czech market cannot rely on this more liberal interpretation when it comes to regulatory enforcement. So the practical message is that in the Czech Republic, we should be treated as more restrictive jurisdiction. However, we hope that this comparative overview that we have presented today has shown that such a strict conclusion is not the only defensible reading of the applicable legal framework. And we hope that also this webinar will help to reopen the conversation on the Czech field, and that the Novo Nordisk will be given ultimately the interpretation that is still legally justifiable, but that also enables healthcare professionals to receive scientifically relevant data for their day-to-day practice.
Thank you very much, Domitil, Joanna, and Katarina for presenting the legal situation in France, in Poland, and in the Czech Republic.